I didn't see it coming the night my father told me to get out of his house. Not because I thought he loved me or because we were close, but because on the night of my 34th birthday, surrounded by nearly 24 members of the Hawthorne family, he chose to humiliate me with the same calmness other men used when offering a toast. One moment I was sitting at the long mahogany table listening to champagne flutes clink and murmured conversations swirl around me like smoke. The next, a heavy leather folder slid across the table and stopped against my plate. My father's voice was steady, practiced a weapon he'd honed for decades. "Sign it," he said. "Let's not drag this out." And when I didn't, when I lifted my eyes and told him quietly that I wanted to read what he expected me to sign, his chair scraped back, his fist slammed the table, and he shouted, "Get out!" No one protested. Not my stepmother, not my cousins, not a single person who had shared my birthday meal. There was only silence, thick and obedient, as if they had all been waiting for this moment. I didn't cry, I didn't beg, I simply stood pushing my chair back into place with care because someone should at least try to keep the night from breaking entirely, and walked away from the family that had always looked at me like an inconvenience dressed in skin. The room behind me erupted into soft whispers as I crossed the dining hall, but none of them dared to speak loud enough to stop me. I passed beneath the crystal chandelier that had hung over every Hawthorne celebration since before I was born, and for a brief second, its cold light flashed against the folder my father had tried to force into my hands. I didn't bother taking it. Whatever he wanted from me could wait. The long hallway leading toward the front doors felt colder than usual, though the house was kept at a temperature that never changed. My heels clicked against the marble floor, echoing back at me like a metronome counting down the last seconds of a life I was no longer expected to live. I could still feel the weight of every stare at my back, every judgment that had been cast on me since childhood. Though no one ever said the truth aloud, I was the Hawthorne who didn't fit their mold, the one who made them uncomfortable, because I refused to fold myself into their expectations. My father's voice didn't follow me, and that more than anything confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't a moment of rage. It was a decision. I reached the foyer and slipped into my coat, smoothing the lapels with unsteady hands. My stepmother, Elaine, watched from the doorway of the sitting room, her arms crossed elegantly, her eyes cool and satisfied. "This should have happened years ago," she murmured. I didn't give her the dignity of a response. Some people carve themselves into your history not because they matter, but because they want you to remember their cruelty. Outside, the night air had teeth. It bit at my cheeks, sliced through the thin silk of my dress. Snow drifted lazily from the sky, the kind that looked beautiful, until it settled into your bones. I breathed it in, feeling strangely lighter the farther I stepped from the doorway. In the driveway, my car was waiting beneath one of the old iron lamps that lined the front circle. I clicked the remote and watched the headlights blink awake, cutting 2 soft paths across the snow. I should have gotten in. I should have driven away without looking back. But something tugged at me, some sense that the night was not finished with me yet. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A man stood near the edge of the property just beyond the stone gate, half hidden in shadow. He wasn't moving. He wasn't smoking or checking a phone or pretending to be doing something else. He was simply watching. I froze. My breath fogged the air. When I blinked, he was gone. It didn't make sense, there was nowhere for him to vanish to, but the space where he'd been was empty. A sharper chill worked its way through my ribs. I slid into the driver's seat and exhaled, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. The leather was cold against my skin, grounding me enough to turn on the engine. The heater hummed to life, though it would take minutes before the air grew warm. My phone vibrated with message after message, missed calls, voicemails, texts from unknown numbers. But I didn't open any of them. I wasn't ready to know what my father had set into motion. When I leaned forward to adjust the rearview mirror, something caught my eye. A shape. A line. I turned slowly. A black envelope was tucked beneath my windshield wiper. My heart began to pound, not in fear, but in recognition, the same stillness I'd felt in the dining room, just before my father stood and severed me from the family. The envelope looked out of place in the snow, its edges crisp, untouched by moisture, as if it had been placed there only seconds ago. I stepped back out of the car and closed the door behind me. The night swallowed the sound. Snow crunched under my heels as I walked around to the front of the car and reached for the envelope, my fingers tingling. My name was written across it in silver ink, steady, elegant, almost ceremonial. Clara Hawthorne. No initials, no flourish, just my name. Inside there was no letter, no threat, no explanation, only a folded document, thick and official, stamped with several seals I didn't recognize. I unfolded it beneath the lamp and my breath caught in my throat. It was a property transfer. A deed, confirming ownership of a private island and the castle built on its cliffs, valued at $95 million, and every line of the document named me, Clara Hawthorne, as the sole and legal owner. The world swayed a little beneath my feet. Snowflakes melted against the paper, and still I stared at the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something more believable. I looked up at the gate again. The man was not there. But someone had left me this. Someone who knew exactly when I would walk away from the house. Someone who knew that tonight of all nights I would finally be untethered from my father's control. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an unknown number. "We've been waiting for you." I dropped into the driver's seat, pulse roaring in my ears. The envelope rested on the passenger seat like a quiet promise. I locked the doors and pressed my fingers to my temples, forcing myself to breathe. I had been thrown out of my family, cast aside like a mistake, humiliated on my own birthday. But someone else, someone watching from the edges, believed I was meant to inherit a $95 million island. And for the first time in my life, I felt the faint tremor of something I had never been allowed to consider. Maybe I wasn't the exile of this family. Maybe I was the threat. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the house. For the last time, the envelope beside me whispering a truth I wasn't ready to face but could no longer ignore. Nothing about my life was ever going to be the same again. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter like a living thing, refusing to be ignored no matter how many times I walked past it. I had left the Hawthorne estate only hours earlier, snow still clinging to the hem of my dress, my father's voice echoing behind me like the final crack of a whip. Yet somehow, impossibly, the envelope had followed me home not by magic, but by intention. Someone had placed it on my car. Someone had written my name on it. Someone had been waiting. I poured a glass of water I didn't drink and leaned both hands on the counter, staring at the folded deed inside the envelope. $95 million. An island. A castle. My name printed on every page, clear and legal and absolute. It made no sense. Nothing about my life, my real life, made room for something so immense. Not after the childhood I'd had. Not after being pushed out of the family that had always preferred to pretend I wasn't there. My phone vibrated for the 5th time in an hour. I let it. The missed calls filled the screen in long, suffocating rows, half of them from numbers I didn't recognize. The Hawthorne family used strangers the way other families used napkins for convenience, for cleanup, for the tasks they didn't want their own hands dirty with. I had no intention of answering, but I needed answers of my own. The envelope stayed in my peripheral vision as I grabbed my coat and keys. Outside, the early winter morning cast a gray haze across the parking lot, condensing the world into cold concrete and pale sky. My breath fogged instantly. I scanned the row of cars out of habit, searching for the SUV I thought I'd imagined last night. It wasn't there. I didn't feel relieved. On the way to Evelyn's office, traffic moved in fits and starts. My mind kept dipping back into the same loop in spite of myself. My father sliding that thick folder across the table, the way the entire room had gone still when I said I wanted to read it, the way not one person had stood up for me when he told me to get out. The humiliation stung less than the silence. But the envelope had changed the terms. Whatever Gregory thought he controlled, whatever he believed he could force me into this island, this castle did not come from him. That alone meant more than he ever intended. Evelyn's building rose sleek and mirrored from the edge of the financial district, reflecting a sky that looked ready to snow. I hurried through the lobby, keeping my head down, and took the elevator to the 12th floor. As soon as it opened, Evelyn stepped out of her office phone, in hand, eyes sharp. "Clara," she said, breathless. "You brought the documents." I held up the envelope. She gestured me inside and locked the door behind us. Her office had always been modern and meticulously organized, but this morning it looked different, tense, as if the air itself had been tightened. Evelyn pulled on a pair of thin gloves and motioned toward the table. "Sit," she said. "Show me." I unfolded the deed again. Evelyn leaned over it, examining each seal, each signature, each embossed marking. Her finger paused over the stamp in the lower corner. "This isn't counterfeit," she murmured. "And it isn't local." She tapped the seal. "It's international. Whoever transferred this did so in a way designed to bypass your father's reach." I swallowed hard. Is that possible? For most people, no. Evelyn straightened. For someone with advanced planning access and intent, yes. She pointed at a line near the bottom. "And look, this wasn't deposited into a trust your family controls. It's a protective transfer, triggered by a specific event." "What event?" Her gaze met mine, and for a fleeting second I saw the woman who had been my only real ally in the Hawthorne world, the one who had given me advice even when she knew it would make Gregory furious. "Expulsion," she said. "It activates if you are formally or publicly expelled from the family." The room swayed. I forced myself to sit back, gripping the armrests. "You're telling me," I said slowly, "someone set up a $95 million property transfer in case my father ever kicked me out?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "And only in that case." I stared at the ceiling, then at the envelope, then at her. "Who," that she said, "is what we need to find out." She pulled up a secured window on her computer and entered a multi-step verification code. The screen displayed a web of documents and encrypted notes. "The transfer came from something called the North Star Trust," she said. "It's not a standard trust. It's what we call a silent structure. Hidden founders, sealed courts, minimal transparency. Almost no one uses trusts like this anymore. They're expensive and complicated." "So someone spent a fortune setting this up," I said. "More than a fortune," Evelyn corrected. "A fortune isn't enough to keep something secret from your father." My hands tightened in my lap. That familiar childhood dread, always waiting for the next trap. The next manipulation rose like a ghost, but it collided with something harder this time. Something steadier. "Why would anyone do all of this for me?" I asked. Before Evelyn could answer, my phone buzzed again. I turned it over to silence the screen, but the preview showed enough of the messages to make my stomach twist. "Lila, I hope you're proud of yourself. Brent, we warned you. Now look what you've done. Unknown number. You're going to pay for this." I placed the phone face down on the table. "It started already," Evelyn murmured. "What has the smear campaign?" She sighed. "Your father wasted no time. He's claiming you stole confidential documents and threatened the family with exposure. None of it will hold up, but in the short term it creates noise." My throat tightened. "He wants to discredit me. He wants to isolate you," Evelyn corrected. "He wants to make sure that when you try to defend yourself, you'll have no credibility left." I shook my head. Odd timing, then, that I apparently own a castle. Evelyn actually smiled at that, an exhausted, reluctant smile. "Well," she said, "let's make something clear. If you went to court tomorrow with this deed, you would win. The transfer is airtight. Gregory has no legal claim to the island." "Then he'll try something else," I said. "He already is." Evelyn tapped the screen. A timestamp flashed. "This," she said, "is access history. Someone checked the status of your trust activation 2 days before you were expelled." My breath stopped. 2 days, I asked. But no one was supposed to know. "Exactly," she said, "which means someone inside the legal system deliberately flagged the trust for your father, or for someone working with him." I rubbed my forehead. "So he knew this would happen." "He suspected," Evelyn said. and he wanted to beat the outcome before it arrived. I leaned back again, letting the weight of the truth settle. My father hadn't just lost control of me last night. He had been preparing for the moment for years, trying to make sure that if I ever slipped out of his grasp, he could ruin me before I realized I had power. But someone else had been preparing too. "Clara," Evelyn said softly, "there's something else." She reached into the envelope and lifted a smaller folded sheet I hadn't noticed. It was sealed old-fashioned with a small wax emblem pressed at the top. The wax symbol was sharp, precise, familiar in a way that made my skin prickle. "What is it?" I whispered. "A letter addressed to you," Evelyn said. "From the original founder of the trust." I hesitated. My pulse thudded in my ears. "Open it," she urged. But my fingers hovered above the seal without breaking it. A trembling sense of recognition curled inside me, like the moment before a memory surfaces or a truth you've been trying not to feel. Evelyn watched me carefully. She didn't force me. She didn't speak. I lowered the letter. "Not yet," I said quietly. "I need to understand more first." Evelyn nodded. "Then let's answer what we can." She reviewed a series of encrypted records while I paced the office. The snow outside had begun to fall harder, thickening against the glass. The city below looked blurred, distant, unreal. When she finally turned back to me, her expression was somber. "Clara," she said, "your father is already preparing a legal challenge against you. He's claiming the trust activation is fraudulent. He wants an injunction placed on your ownership of the island." I bit the inside of my cheek. "He can't touch the deed." "He can make life difficult," she corrected. "He can spin this into a narrative where you're unstable or being manipulated." "That's always been his narrative," I snapped. "Even when I was a child." Evelyn stepped closer. "Then it may be time for you to stop letting him decide who you are." The words hit deeper than she intended. The room fell still. For a moment I felt something inside me shift, not anger, not fear, but a quiet certainty growing roots. "I want to go to the island," I said. Evelyn blinked. "Now, yes," I said. "I need to see it. I need to know what this really is. If someone built a trust to protect me, if they spent years preparing for this moment, I want to understand why." Evelyn nodded slowly. "I'll arrange transportation. And Clara, be careful. If someone did this for you, they knew exactly how dangerous your family could become." "I know," I murmured. "I've known my whole life." I picked up the envelope and slid it into my coat, feeling the weight of it settle against my ribs. Then I stepped out into the hallway, the snow swirling beyond the window panes like a world rearranging itself. By the time I reached the elevator, another text arrived from an unknown number. "Don't trust anyone." I stared at the screen, then turned the phone off completely. For the first time since leaving the Hawthorne estate, I felt an unexpected calm settle inside me. My father had taken everything from me, my childhood, my place in the family, my voice. But he hadn't taken this. The island existed. The deed was real. The truth was waiting. And I was done running from anything with the name Hawthorne attached to it. Whatever waited for me offshore answers danger ghosts, I was going to face it. Alone, if I had to. But not afraid. The salt air hit me before the island even came into view, sharp and cold, and strangely clean, as if the world I'd left behind hadn't followed me across the water. The seaplane shuddered as it descended its float, slicing toward the gray-blue waves. The pilot hadn't spoken more than a dozen words since we left the mainland, but when he finally pointed ahead, his voice carried a note of something almost reverent. "There," he said, "your island. My island." The words didn't feel real, not when I'd woken up this morning in a one-bedroom apartment still smelling faintly of last night's humiliation. Not when only 12 hours earlier my father had thrown me out of a house that had never truly been mine. And certainly not now, as a jagged silhouette rose from the water stone walls, towers ironwork, a castle carved into the cliff, as if it were daring the sea to swallow it. The plane skimmed onto the water, bounced once, then steadied itself as it drifted toward a narrow wooden dock. A single figure stood waiting. Even from a distance, he didn't move the way people did when they were uncertain. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, posture straight, despite the wind, his dark coat billowing like a flag in a storm. "That'll be Jonas Hale," the pilot muttered. "Caretaker. Loyal as they come. Or so I'm told. Told by whom?" He didn't elaborate. The floats kissed the dock, and the pilot tossed a rope to the man waiting. Jonas Hale secured the line with practiced efficiency, then turned toward me. When I stepped onto the dock, the boards creaked beneath my weight, but he didn't extend a hand to steady me. He only inclined his head, studying me with an intensity that made me hesitate. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, "welcome to Bastion Island. The castle has been prepared for your arrival." Prepared. As if someone had known I would come today, not months ago or years ago, but today. The thought pressed against my ribs. "Thank you," I said softly. He motioned toward a path that led upward into the cliffs. The wind tore at my coat as I followed him, my footsteps crunching against gravel and stone. The air smelled of rain and distant storms. Above us, the castle rose in layers. Arches, ramparts, narrow windows set into thick walls. It was beautiful in the way abandoned cathedrals were beautiful, quiet, solemn, holding secrets that had been allowed to gather dust. Inside the main hall, warmth greeted me instantly. Jonas must have lit the fires earlier. The scent of cedar crackled through the room, mixing with the faint tang of sea salt that had wedged itself permanently into the stone. "I've arranged a tour," he said. "There are areas you'll need to understand before we discuss the trust, the castle, the island." Somehow all of it felt woven into a single thread I hadn't yet tugged. Before that I said, "May I ask something? You may ask anything," he replied. "How long have you known I would come?" His expression shifted, but only barely. A flicker of something like grief or memory or loyalty. 3 years, he said. "I was instructed to keep the island in perfect condition. I was told that when you arrived I would know." My skin prickled. "Told by whom? By the original owner?" He paused. "By William Hawthorne." The name struck me like a cold wave. I had never met him. My father spoke of him rarely, and when he did it was with bitterness so thick it coated the conversation. William the eccentric uncle. William the idealist. William the man who left the family and never returned. "I didn't know he knew you," Jonas finished gently. "Oh, he knew you. He prepared this place for you." The ground beneath the certainty of his voice felt unsteady. I followed him deeper into the castle, into a corridor lined with portraits long since darkened by time. None of them bore faces I recognized. At the end of the hall he pushed open a heavy iron door. "This," he said, "is the records hall." The room was carved directly into the cliff. Thick, reinforced walls. Temperature-controlled vents humming softly. Shelves lined the perimeter filled with boxes, binders, leather portfolios. In the center sat a desk bolted into the stone itself. Jonas touched a panel near the door, and a muted blue light spread across the ceiling. "These documents," he said, "belong to the Hawthorne family. Most of them were gathered by William, not for preservation, but for protection. Protection from what I asked." He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped toward a metal drawer and pulled it open. Inside lay a folder stamped in red ink, restricted access Hawthorne agreements. My breath caught. Gregory had shown me a folder last night too, something he wanted me to sign, something he refused to let me read. Something he believed would keep the family's assets intact. Something that, in hindsight, had been designed to trap me. Jonas placed the restricted folder in my hands. "There are truths in here your father never wanted you to see." I opened it slowly. Contracts, letters, signatures, some I recognized as my father's, some I didn't. Clauses that bent morality into something unrecognizable. Documents outlining financial decisions that were never meant for daylight. The farther I read, the colder I felt. "Why would William collect these?" I whispered. "Because he believed someone would need them," Jonas said. "Someone who could not be controlled. Someone who would one day be pushed out and forced to choose between silence and truth. My chest tightened. I closed the folder and looked at him. "You mean me?" "Yes," he said simply. "I mean you." The enormity of it pressed against me until I could barely breathe. William had left the family decades ago. But he had never walked away from the truth. And he had never forgotten me even though we'd never met. "What else did he prepare?" I asked. Jonas led me through a side passage into a spiral staircase that wound upward into the highest part of the castle. We emerged into a narrow hall lined with old oak doors. Most were shut, but one at the very end stood apart, metal, not wood, and fitted with a biometric scanner. As I stepped toward it, the scanner blinked awake. Jonas inhaled sharply. "It's recognizing you." "That's impossible," I whispered. "No," he said. "It's intentional." I raised my hand slowly, letting the scanner read me. A soft tone sounded. The machine flickered, then displayed a message in sharp red letters. "Access not yet authorized, conditions incomplete." A shiver trailed down my spine. "What conditions?" I asked. Jonas shook his head. "William never told me. Only that the room would open for you when the time was right. Not before." I stared at the steel door, feeling the weight of something waiting behind it, something William didn't want anyone but me to see, something he believed I would need. Before I could ask more, an alarm chimed across the hallway, low, steady, unmistakably mechanical. Jonas pressed a hand to his earpiece, listening. When he looked at me, his expression had shifted into one I'd only seen on men who knew danger intimately. "There's a vessel approaching the island," he said. "Unidentified. It's not local." My throat tightened. Could it be the same people following me? Possibly. He moved toward the stairs. "The security perimeter picked them up 10 minutes ago. They're circling the island." I followed him down through the castle, each step heavier than the last. We reached the main hall where a large display screen showed the radar feed, an oblong shape moving steadily in the water, too close, too intentional. "They aren't broadcasting identification," Jonas said. "Family?" I asked. Jonas hesitated. "Your father doesn't handle his own surveillance. But Hawthorne Corporate Security? Yes, they've done far worse than this." I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to quell the rising panic. They had found me. Already. Less than 24 hours after Gregory threw me out of the house, his reach was curling its way across the sea toward the one place I thought might be safe. "What do they want?" I asked. Jonas met my eyes with an honesty that felt like truth, and warning wrapped into one. "They want control," he said. "And they want whatever William left behind for you." The wind howled against the castle walls, rattling old iron fixtures. Somewhere in the distance, a gull cried out. The approaching vessel continued its slow, predatory circle. I tightened my grip on the envelope tucked inside my coat. I had been humiliated, exiled, pushed out. But this was new. Someone had protected me for years. Someone had built a castle and a trust and a hidden vault of records. Someone had believed I would eventually face the family that had tried to crush me. Someone had believed I would fight. The radar beeped again, sharper this time. Jonas straightened. "They're getting closer." I looked at the castle around me, cold stone, flickering torchlight walls built to endure storms far older than me, and something inside me steadied. "Let them come," I said. Jonas studied me for a moment, surprised, then nodded once. And as the vessel edged nearer, as the wind thickened and the sea churned below, I realized that whatever truth waited behind the locked steel door upstairs, whatever secrets William had left for me, they were no longer something I feared. They were something I needed. Because the moment I stepped onto this island, my life ceased to belong to Gregory Hawthorne. And for the first time, it began to belong to me. The storm rolled in faster than I expected, swallowing the horizon in a curtain of gray that made the sea look deeper and more dangerous. By the time Jonas and I finished reviewing the castle's perimeter alarms, the wind had begun to rattle the shutters, sending long, hollow groans through the old stone corridors. I stood beside him at the massive window overlooking the eastern cliffs, watching the dark silhouette of the unknown vessel as it continued its slow, taunting loop around the island. "They're testing us," Jonas said quietly. "Testing the defenses. Testing your reaction." My reaction, I repeated as if it were a word that belonged to someone else. He turned toward me with something like sympathy softened by caution. "You're not just the resident of this island, Miss Hawthorne. You're its owner, and that means anyone who comes here is responding to you." The truth of that settled into me like ice and heat at the same time. I wrapped my arms around myself, stepping back from the window. If my father sent them to intimidate me, he wasted the trip. I don't scare easily anymore. A half smile flickered at Jonas's mouth, the first hint of warmth I'd seen in him. "No," he murmured. "You're much more like William than I expected." The air stilled. My heartbeat rose to my throat. "You keep saying that," I said. "That he knew me, that he prepared all this for me. But I never met him. Not once. Why would he?" Jonas held up a hand, stopping me. "I understand your questions. And your owed answers. But the records hall wasn't the only place where William left his intentions." He nodded toward the opposite wing. "There's something else you need to see. Something he insisted would matter when your father eventually turned on you." "Eventually," I echoed. "So it wasn't an if." "No. William never used the word if." Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the hallway for a moment, before plunging it back into dim firelight. Jonas led me down a long passage I hadn't noticed before, a narrow corridor lined with high glass windows that framed the storm as if it were a moving portrait. Each flash of lightning threw our shadows across the stone floor in ragged shapes. At the end of the corridor, Jonas paused before a tall wooden door reinforced with steel bands. A heavy lock sat in the middle, not old but high-tech, the kind corporations use to guard sensitive archives. "William called this room the Quiet Vault," Jonas said, as he pulled a keycard from inside his coat. "It was where he placed documents he didn't want the Hawthorne family to know existed." "That sounds like everything I've ever needed," I muttered. He didn't smile this time. Instead, he scanned the keycard and entered a code into the keypad. A soft click echoed through the hall, followed by a mechanical hum as the lock disengaged. The door swung open. The air inside was cooler, stiller, as if the room had not been disturbed in years. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each stacked with boxes of varying sizes, some leather-bound, some steel, some paper. A dim light glowed overhead, illuminating the dust motes that drifted in slow circles. Jonas stepped aside. "He wanted you to see this first." On a small pedestal near the center of the room lay a bundle of documents wrapped in dark cloth. I approached it, slowly, heart-pounding, and lifted the fabric. Inside was a ledger, an old one. Its edges were frayed, its cover worn, its pages thick beneath my fingers. I sat on the wooden bench beside the pedestal and opened it. The first page stole my breath. It wasn't financial records. It wasn't a list of transactions or properties or trust arrangements. It was a journal, handwritten, belonging to William Hawthorne. The ink had faded in places, and the handwriting slanted sharply, decisive, urgent. I skimmed the first paragraphs and felt a quiet tremor pass through me. Today I made my decision. I will not allow Gregory to inherit the full Hawthorne power structure, not while he builds his empire on manipulation. Not while he believes no one will ever challenge him. My throat tightened. I turned the page. There is someone else who can. Someone he cannot control. Someone he already fears. Beside me, Jonas drew a careful breath. "He didn't write names," he said. "Not in that journal, not in case someone got to it. But the meaning isn't subtle. I felt as though every word on the page reached out, threading itself into my ribs. He meant me. He did." I closed the journal, pressing my palm against the leather cover as if it could steady me. "But why would he choose me?" Jonas hesitated. "Because William believed Gregory would turn on you eventually. Because he believed the truth would find you. And because he trusted you more than anyone else with what he uncovered. I opened the journal again, flipping through entries dated over a decade apart. They weren't daily logs. They were fragments, observations, warnings, research, suspicions. A pattern began to emerge the more I read. William had been tracking Gregory's operations long before anyone else knew what he was capable of. And there were letters, carbon copies William had written and never sent. One addressed to an attorney, one addressed to a journalist, and one addressed to me. I lifted it gently, noticing that unlike the others, it was sealed. "May I?" I whispered. Jonas nodded. I cracked the seal. The letter was short, only a few lines, but each one carved into me with unsettling precision. Clara, if you are reading this, then the day I feared has arrived. Gregory will never tolerate dissent, not from me, not from your mother, and not from you. But you are stronger than you know, and this island is proof. Everything here was built to protect the truth, including the truth about yourself. Find the people he silenced. Find what he hid. You are the one I chose. W.H. My vision blurred for a moment. My mother, I said softly, the word catching. He mentioned my mother. Jonas lowered his gaze. There are things you should know, but not all of them today. Not yet. I gripped the edge of the bench. He said, Gregory silenced her. Jonas's silence was answer enough. Lightning flashed again and thunder cracked so loudly it shook the floor beneath us. The storm outside was intensifying, waves pounding the cliffs like fists. I looked up at Jonas. Tell me the rest. He hesitated long enough to make me wonder if he would refuse. Then he said, your mother was not the problem. Your father was. Heat prickled behind my eyes. What did he do? He made her disappear. My breath left me in a shudder. No, I whispered. He told me she died. He told me he lied, Jonas said. And William spent years trying to uncover what really happened. Bastion Island became his refuge, his archive, his war room. And now it's yours. The shock of it pulsed through me, sharp enough to make the world blur. I stood needing movement, needing air that didn't hold so much weight. Jonas followed me to the doorway, then stopped abruptly. The hallway was no longer quiet. A strange low hum vibrated through the air, barely audible but unmistakably mechanical. What is that? I asked. Jonas stepped forward, slowly placing his hand on the wall. It's coming from the exterior sensors. The vessel is close, too close. The hum grew louder, resonating through the stones beneath our feet. Jonas hurried to the window at the end of the hall and threw the shutters open. A spotlight swept across the cliffs, cutting through the storm and casting jagged shadows across the castle walls. They're scanning the perimeter, he said. They're looking for structural entry points. My pulse quickened. For what to come inside? For whatever your father wants, Jonas answered. He doesn't send people to observe. He sends them to retrieve. We hurried down the winding staircase toward the main hall, the sound of the storm pressing closer with every turn. When we reached the bottom, Jonas activated the internal defense system. Steel shutters sliding over windows, reinforced doors locking into place, dim lights switching to emergency hues. I stood in the center of the hall watching as the castle transformed itself into a fortress around me. Miss Hawthorne. Jonas said carefully, "We have to assume they'll escalate." "Why?" I said. "What could they possibly want that badly?" He looked at me with an expression that mixed sorrow and warning. "Everything." Thunder boomed again, shaking dust from the rafters. Jonas moved toward the control panel, entering commands I couldn't decipher. "The castle will hold," he said. "It always has." "And me?" I asked. He turned, meeting my gaze with unwavering certainty. "You'll hold too. You're a Hawthorne, but not his kind." I exhaled shakily. The storm slammed against the window panes. The vessel's spotlight swept across the courtyard once more, lingering this time as if studying me through the walls. "Jonas," I whispered, "he's never let me go. Not really, not once in my life." "He didn't let William go either," Jonas said. "And William fought to protect the truth until his last day." A tremor moved through me, not fear but something steadier, something sharper. Resolve. I stepped closer to the window. The vessel hovered just beyond the rocks, waiting, watching, circling like a threat dressed in steel. "I'm done letting him decide what happens to me," I said. Jonas nodded as if he'd been waiting for exactly that. Then he said, "Good. Because tonight, Miss Hawthorne, your father just declared war." The wind howled, the lights flickered. And somewhere deep within the castle, something that had been silent for years finally stirred. Jonas found me in the library just after dawn, though I hadn't truly slept. The storm had quieted sometime in the early morning hours, leaving behind a strange stillness that felt heavier than the wind itself. The fire had burned down to embers, casting only a faint orange glow across the carved bookshelves and the worn leather armchairs. I sat curled near the fire with William's journal in my hands, tracing the slanted handwriting until the words blurred. Everything I had read pressed against my ribs, warnings, observations, suspicions, all of them orbiting the same truth William had been preparing for the moment Gregory would turn on me long before anyone believed he could. Jonas stepped inside and lowered his voice. "Miss Hawthorne, we should talk." I looked up at him, unsure how much of the exhaustion was visible on my face. "About the vessel, partly." He hesitated. "Mostly about something else." He motioned toward the small table beside me where a tray of tea sat untouched. I set the journal aside and followed him deeper into the library. It was vast, with tall windows that framed the gray morning sea. Jonas stopped near a corner lined with old nautical maps and gestured for me to sit. "You asked yesterday why William trusted you," he said. "The truth is, he didn't only trust you, he believed in you. He spoke of you often, even long before you were old enough to understand what the Hawthorne name really meant." I blinked. "You knew him well." "I served him for nearly 20 years, Jonas said. "Long enough to see the burden he carried, long enough to see the cost." He moved toward a shelf and took down a small dust-covered box. He handled it with surprising reverence. "This belonged to him," Jonas said softly. "He asked me to give it to you when the time came." "When the time came," I whispered. "What does that mean?" He opened the box. Inside was a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in tight, careful handwriting, more careful than the journal, more deliberate. Beneath the envelope lay a simple key, old and iron-worn, tied to a red ribbon. The air thickened in my chest. "This was left for me," I asked. "Years ago," Jonas said. "Long before William vanished." The word vanished struck me like a cold blade. No one ever explained what happened to him. "No," Jonas said, "because no one knew." Thunder didn't shake the castle this morning, but something inside me felt just as unstable. I slid my thumb beneath the flap of the envelope and unfolded the letter. "Clara, if you are holding this, then my absence has lasted longer than I intended. There are truths in this place that belong to you and you alone. Truths I could not speak while your father's influence still reached this far. Trust Jonas. Trust the island. But above all, trust your instinct. It will protect you when the people who should have done so failed. William." I stared at the ink until it began to waver. "Why didn't he come back?" I asked quietly. "Why did he leave all of this to me instead of staying to protect it?" Jonas's expression shifted, pain memory, something deeper. "Because your father made this place too dangerous for him to return. And because William knew that one day you would need a refuge he no longer had." The room seemed to shrink around me. I ran my fingers over the key, feeling its weight. "What does it open?" I asked. "A door he never allowed anyone else to enter." Jonas gestured toward the far corridor. "William's private study." I stiffened. "The one connected to the sealed wing upstairs." "Yes." I rose from the chair, gripping the key so tightly the edges pressed crescents into my palm. Jonas led me out of the library through the torchlit hallways up the winding stone staircase until we reached a narrow landing just beneath the highest tower. A door stood there, wooden, reinforced with bands of dark metal. its surface gouged in places as if someone had tried once long ago to pry it open. "This is it," Jonas said. My breath shivered in my chest. I lifted the key, slid it into the old iron lock, and turned it. The mechanism clicked with a low, ancient groan. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door swung open on its own weight. William's study was nothing like I expected. It wasn't grand or intimidating. It wasn't filled with artifacts or expensive furniture. It was human. A small writing desk covered with papers, a cracked leather chair, sketches of architectural plans pinned to the far wall, and everywhere across the desk, the shelves, even the floor, were stacks of folders tied with twine. "This is where he spent his last days on the island," Jonas said quietly. "Before he disappeared." Something inside my chest tightened. "What was he working on?" "Preparing," Jonas said. "Documenting. And searching for evidence your father tried desperately to erase." I stepped deeper into the room and felt a faint draft brush my ankles. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust. My eyes drifted over the pinned diagrams, blueprints of the island, layers of notes scrawled in the margins. One phrase repeated itself across several pages: "Emergency vault successor access only." My skin prickled. Successor, meaning me. Jonas nodded. "William designated you long before the trust was activated. He believed you would inherit not just the island, but his fight." The weight of that settled on me like a second spine, heavy, necessary, impossible to shrug off. I knelt beside a stack of folders and opened the top one. Inside were photographs, grainy surveillance images of my father entering a building I didn't recognize. My breath caught. The next photo showed him leaving with a briefcase. The next one a handoff between him and a man whose face was partially obscured. "What is all this?" I whispered. Jonas crouched beside me. "Evidence. Of the people Gregory used, the money he moved, the threats he made." My head began to swim. "And William kept all of this hidden. He had to," Jonas said. "Your father would have destroyed every shred of it." I flipped through page after page, and with each one my stomach knotted tighter. I'd suspected that Gregory had done terrible things, but seeing it laid out so plainly felt like plunging into ice water. And I understood something then: the island wasn't a gift. It was a shield. As I turned the final page, a small scrap of paper slipped free and fluttered to the floor. I picked it up. A single line was written in William's hand. "She must find the truth before he does." "She," I breathed. "Who?" But before I could finish the question, Jonas stood and motioned me toward the desk. "There's more." He opened the bottom drawer and removed a sealed envelope marked with my initials. Inside sat a smaller notebook, thin, leather-bound, and filled with sketches of a woman's face. The sketches were hauntingly familiar. A woman with soft eyes, strong features, a quiet sadness carved into her expression. The lines of her face echoed mine in a way that made my breath falter. "This is," I whispered, "this is my mother." Jonas nodded. William didn't just know her. He tried to protect her. My throat burned. "From Gregory?" "Yes." The room tilted, the truth bending the world at its edges. I clutched the notebook to my chest. "He made her disappear," I whispered. Jonas didn't answer. He didn't need to. The storm outside had begun again, wind rattling the old shutters. I swallowed against the rising ache in my chest and forced myself to breathe. "There's something else you need to see," Jonas said. He led me to the far corner of the study, where a narrow door stood half hidden behind a hanging tapestry. He pushed it open, revealing a steep stone staircase descending into darkness. "This leads to the sub-level," he said. "To a room William designed after your mother vanished." My pulse thrummed painfully in my ears. "For what? For secrets," Jonas said, "and for protection." We descended into the dim stairwell, each step colder than the last. When we reached the bottom, Jonas lit a lantern and held it up, revealing a vault-like door with a biometric scanner and an old-fashioned lock. "The key you have opens this part," he said. My fingers trembled as I inserted the key. The lock released with a heavy clunk. Jonas pressed his hand to the scanner panel, and it flickered to life. "Your turn," he said. I pressed my palm against the scanner. The machine word processing searching. Then, access granted. The vault door slid open. Inside was a room unlike any other in the castle. Not cold stone, not old wood, but glass and steel and light modern deliberate humming faintly with power. On the central table lay a thick binder worn at the edges as if handled often. Above it, a single sentence had been etched into the glass, "For Clara. When she is ready." My knees nearly buckled. Jonas set the lantern aside. "This is the file William never meant your father to find. The file he spent his final years building. The file he believed you would need more than anything else." I stepped toward the table, heart thudding painfully, fingers brushing the cover. Inside, I already knew was a truth large enough to crack open everything I had ever believed about my mother, about Gregory, about the woman I was becoming. I pulled the binder closer. Jonas stepped back to give me space, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the vault and the storm raging above us, as if the island itself were holding its breath waiting for me to turn the page. The binder felt heavier than it should, as if the weight inside it wasn't paper, but a truth that had waited too long in the dark. I opened the cover slowly, expecting another ledger or stack of contracts, something financial, something cold. But the first page wasn't a document at all. It was a photograph, a grainy image of my father standing beside a woman I had never seen before. Her face was turned slightly away, her features soft and blurred by time, yet unmistakably familiar in a way that made my stomach lurch. Something in the shape of her jaw, the slope of her cheekbone. A likeness I'd spent my whole life wondering about without any proof. Jonas stepped closer. "That's the image William asked me to protect." I traced the outline of her face with my eyes. "Who is she?" "We don't know her name," Jonas said carefully. "But we know what she was." I swallowed hard. "And what was she?" His gaze lowered. "A witness, one Gregory wanted to silence." Before I could ask more, the vault lights flickered. Jonas lifted his head sharply. We both listened. A muffled chime echoed from the upper hallway, the castle's internal alert system. Not an intruder alarm, not a threat signal, a communication alert. Jonas turned toward the stairwell. "Someone is trying to reach you." We climbed back up the narrow stone stairs, the echo of the alert bouncing off the walls like a heartbeat out of rhythm. When we reached the main level, Jonas walked briskly toward the library where the communication console sat in the corner, like an old radio operator's desk. The screen was lit with dozens of notifications. But one stood out, dozens of news alerts, images of my face, headlines scrolling so fast my eyes barely kept up. Journalist Harper Lane releases statement on Hawthorne family. Hawthorne heir threatened into silence, dispute over private trust, may involve criminal cover-up. I stepped closer. My hands began to tremble. "Why is this happening?" Jonas scanned the screen. "Because your father anticipated your absence, and he's responding with force." The phone on the desk buzzed. Jonas answered, placing it on speaker. Evelyn's voice came through sharp and breathless. "Clara, tell me you're safe." "I'm fine," I said, though my voice shook. "You're trending nationally," Evelyn said. "Your father went public this morning. He claims you stole sensitive documents from the family estate. He's calling you mentally unstable and emotionally compromised." My chest tightened. "He's trying to discredit me before anything can surface." "Exactly," Evelyn said. "But that's not the worst of it." My breath caught. "What else?" Gregory filed an emergency request with the federal court to freeze all your assets, including the island transfer. I sat down slowly, the world tilting. "He can't touch it." "He's trying," she said. "And if he succeeds, he'll argue you have no legal right to remain on the island." Every muscle in my body stiffened. "He wants me off the island," I whispered. "He wants you isolated," Evelyn corrected. "Cornered, discredited, and quiet." Jonas leaned over the console. "There's more." He clicked through alerts until a video opened on the screen. Harper Lane made a public statement this morning naming you directly. The screen filled with the image of a woman in her late 50s, sharp eyes, gray-streaked hair pulled into a tight knot, a voice made of smoke and steel. I have reason to believe, she said calmly, that Clara Hawthorne is the only person left with access to information that could expose serious crimes at the highest levels of the Hawthorne family. My breath caught. Harper continued, I am willing to testify on her behalf, and I know others who will. But I fear Gregory Hawthorne has already set into motion efforts to silence her. The screen cut out. I blinked hard, feeling the message sink beneath my skin. She risked everything I murmured. For me. Evelyn exhaled sharply through the phone. Harper has been investigating your father for over a decade. William trusted her. I think she's trying to protect you. My heart thundered. What does she know more than anyone else alive? Evelyn said grimly. But Gregory knows that too, which means she's in danger. The castle lights flickered again twice, then steady. Jonas's expression hardened. That wasn't weather. The external cameras just picked up a drone near the southern cliff. I spun toward him. Another one. This one is bigger, Jonas said, lowering the blinds and adjusting the monitor. Military grade. Someone wants live surveillance footage. I stared at the screen. A sleek drone hovered just beyond the defensive perimeter. Is that Gregory's? I asked. Jonas nodded. His team, at least. They use drones like this to record structural weaknesses in buildings. My stomach dropped. Weaknesses for what Jonas turned toward me. For entry. I stood there trembling not from fear alone, but from fury rising like something volcanic inside my chest. He's escalating, Evelyn said through the speaker. Clara, you need to understand your father is terrified. Terrified of whatever William left behind for you. Terrified. Something about that word steadied me, because Gregory had never feared me before, and yet now he was circling my island like a predator sensing a trap. Jonas, I said quietly what was in the vault I opened downstairs. The binder, the drafts, the surveillance images. What were they leading toward? Jonas hesitated. The thing Gregory worked hardest to bury. And what's that? That William wasn't acting alone, Jonas said. He had help, a partner, someone deeply connected to your family's past. I froze. You don't mean my mother? Jonas lowered his gaze. I believe your mother uncovered something William tried to protect, something Gregory could never allow to become public. A chill cut through me sharper than the wind outside. The drone's hum grew louder, vibrating the very windows. I pressed a hand to my forehead. So my mother. She wasn't just a victim. No, Jonas said. She was the key. My throat tightened, and that's why she disappeared. Jonas nodded once. The drone shifted direction. Evelyn's voice sharpened. Clara, listen to me. Your father isn't trying to scare you off that island. He's trying to retrieve whatever evidence William hid there and destroy it before you find it. I closed my eyes. In the darkness behind them, a single phrase from William's journal rose like a ghost. She must find the truth before he does. When I opened my eyes, they felt different, clearer, sharper, alive, with something Gregory had never allowed me to feel: purpose. Jonas, I said quietly, we're not running. No, he agreed, we're preparing. I stepped closer to the window, watching the drone trace a slow circle over the crashing waves. He wants to bury the truth, I whispered, but I'm done being buried with it. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Evelyn said almost reverently, Clara. William would be proud. A lump formed in my throat. I blinked it away and straightened. What's our next move? I asked. Jonas tapped a few buttons on the console. The drone's image zoomed in. We let them watch. We let them think they're approaching freely. And then I whispered. A small, unexpected smile curved his mouth. And then we show them that you're not the girl your father threw out of his house. The drone circled again, its shadow sweeping across the cliffs like a threat. But for the first time, I didn't feel threatened. I felt ready. The email arrived just after sunset, chiming softly on the console in William's study. So soft I wouldn't have noticed it if the room hadn't been silent. Jonas and I had spent the last hour reviewing aerial footage of the drone's movements, searching for a pattern, a weakness, something that might tell us what Gregory intended next. But when the alert sounded, Jonas stopped mid-sentence. "That signal," he said quietly. "It's internal." I crossed the room and stared at the glowing screen. The sender field was a name I hadn't seen in over 2 decades, yet I recognized it instantly from the letters in William's journal. William Hawthorne. My heart stuttered, disbelief rising like a tide. Jonas, he's gone. He didn't have access to email. Jonas stepped closer. He set automated triggers. If certain conditions were met, messages would send on their own. I clicked the message before I could lose my nerve. Clara. If you're receiving this, the truth about my death has begun to reveal itself. W. My throat tightened around the breath I tried and failed to draw. He's dead, I whispered. He's been dead for years. Jonas didn't look away from the screen. He never confirmed he was alive. He only disappeared. But this, I said, fingers shaking. This sounds like he knew something would happen to him. Jonas's expression was solemn. He knew Gregory. The message had a single attachment, a file locked with an encrypted code. When I tried to open it, the system denied me instantly. Verification required testimony holder ID. What does that mean? I whispered. It means Jonas said someone else must be here. Before either of us could speak again, a tremor passed through the castle. Not from the sea, not from the drone. A distant thrum of rotors. A helicopter. Jonas's eyes widened, then narrowed. No one authorized a landing. We ran. Down the staircase, through the corridor, across the upper hall. The wind roared against the windows, shaking glass in their frames. When we reached the balcony overlooking the courtyard, the helicopter was already descending toward the landing pad. A smaller private aircraft, older model, painted in faded green and white. Jonas leaned forward. That's not Hawthorne's security. That's a press aircraft. Mid-90s build. The name clicked in my mind before he said it. Harper Lane. I exhaled sharply as the helicopter touched down, sending loose leaves skittering across the stones. A woman emerged, tall, silver-haired, wearing a dark coat that flapped wildly in the wind. Even from a distance, she radiated purpose. Harper Lane moved toward the castle with the steadiness of someone who had outrun danger before. She came, I whispered. She actually came. Jonas nodded, still tense. Then William chose her for a reason. We met her at the entrance. Up close, Harper looked older than she appeared on television. The lines around her eyes deeper, but her presence was sharper, almost electric. She extended her hand without hesitation. Clara Hawthorne. I swallowed. Ms. Lane Harper, she corrected. I've waited a long time to see you. Her grip was strong, anchoring. When she entered the castle, she paused as though taking in every detail, its architecture, its shadows, its secrets. I knew this place existed, she murmured. But I didn't know William gave it to you. How did you know him? I asked. She glanced at Jonas. He nodded once as if granting silent permission. Harper motioned us toward the library where she sat in one of the high-backed chairs. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of years. I was an investigative journalist when William reached out to me. Your uncle was trying to expose a charity fraud linked to your father. He needed someone who wasn't afraid of the Hawthorne name. My breath hitched. Charity fraud, Harper nodded. Millions redirected, families ruined, and every thread led back to Gregory Hawthorne. I felt cold. William tried to stop him. He did more than try, Harper said. He documented everything. Money trails, shell companies, threats, meetings in the dead of night. My pulse quickened. And my father. Your father, she said carefully, threatened every witness who would have testified. William knew he was next. Jonas paced slowly near the fireplace as if he'd heard the story before, but still needed distance. "You said witnesses," I whispered. "Plural." Harper's eyes sharpened. There were two. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. "William and—" "You're not ready for that name yet," Harper said gently, "but you've already seen her picture." The photograph from the binder flashed through my mind. The woman beside Gregory, the woman with my cheekbones. "My mother," I breathed. Harper didn't deny it. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the room in a stark flash. Harper opened her coat and removed a small waterproof case. She placed it on the table between us. "This," she said, "is what William gave me before he disappeared. He told me you were the only person who could open it." My hands shook as I lifted the case. Inside was a USB drive, simple, silver, unassuming. Jonas inhaled sharply. "William's testimony." Harper nodded. "The last version he recorded. The one that names your father directly." The room throbbed with silence. "Why didn't you release it?" I asked. Harper's voice turned quiet. "Because William told me not to. Not until the Hawthorns turned on you. He believed your exile would signal that Gregory had begun the final stage of whatever he planned." A chill rippled through me. "And he wanted me to finish what he couldn't." Harper met my eyes. "Yes." Jonas approached the console and inserted the USB drive. The screen flickered, then demanded secondary authentication DNA key required. Harper's brow furrowed. "That's new," Jonas nodded. "It means William locked the final testimony to DNA from the Hawthorne bloodline." I stared at the screen, throat tight. "Mine," Jonas hesitated. "Possibly." Or, the implication hit me before he said it. "Gregory." "What would he need my father's DNA for?" I asked. "To prove the accusations," Harper said softly. "William didn't want the truth to be deniable. He wanted evidence that tied directly to Gregory." My hands curled into fists. "So I can't open it. Not alone," Jonas said. "But William wouldn't have left this without a way." Harper leaned back, eyes narrowing in thought. He always built contingencies, hidden paths, substitutions. "Think, was there anything else he left for you?" "The letters, the key, the study, the vault, the second sealed room I couldn't enter. The room upstairs. The biometric door labeled for successor access." I stood abruptly. "There is something." Jonas straightened. "The locked wing." Harper rose too. "Show me." We moved quickly through the castle, the thunder growing louder overhead, the walls seeming to shudder with each heavy strike. When we reached the narrow hallway leading to the sealed room, the scanner flickered as if sensing us before we reached it. I stepped forward, letting the light wash over my face. The screen blinked. "Partial match detected. Second key required." Harper exhaled. "Your mother." I stared at the glowing panel, heart pounding. "Jonas," I whispered, "what was her name?" He looked torn, as if holding a truth he'd guarded for years. Finally, he said, "Leora." The name hit me like a physical blow, beautiful, haunting, familiar, even though I'd never heard it spoken. Harper touched my shoulder. "Clara." "She's not gone. Not entirely. William preserved everything she left behind. It may be in this room." My breath caught. The scanner waited. Another rumble of thunder shook the floors as Jonas opened a small panel near the base of the wall, something I hadn't noticed before. Inside was a fingerprint reader and a second biometric input for an item recognition pad. "Item," I whispered. Jonas nodded. "Something that belonged to your mother. Something that still carries her imprint." The world narrowed around me. I tried to think, letters, sketches, the notebook. Then I remembered. The necklace. The silver pendant from the binder, worn and tarnished but clearly loved. I pulled it from my pocket and placed it on the sensor. A long pause. Then, match confirmed. Access granted. The locks disengaged with a deep mechanical groan. The door eased outward, releasing a draft of cold air that smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. Harper's voice trembled. "Clara, this room belonged to your mother." I stepped inside slowly, heart splitting open with every breath. Photographs lined the walls. Letters were tucked into drawers. A shawl draped across the arm of a chair, the ghost of a life stolen too soon. At the far end sat a box carved with two initials interlocked, W+L. I approached it, hands trembling, and lifted the lid. Inside was a slim envelope sealed with wax. To my daughter, Leora. The room fell away. The sea fell silent. Even the storm seemed to hold its breath. Harper whispered, "Clara, open it." I slid my finger beneath the flap. Inside was a letter written in a hand so fluid and gentle it felt like a touch. My dearest Clara. If you are reading this, then the truth has begun to find you, and you must not turn from it. You were never meant to live in your father's shadow. You were born from the fight against everything he built. William protected me when I had nowhere else to go. He protected you when I no longer could. You will hear terrible things about Gregory. Believe them. But do not let them define you. When the time comes, follow the path William left. It will lead you to the truth about him. And about me. With all my love, Mama. My breath shattered. Jonas looked down, eyes damp. Harper turned away, giving me space. I clutched the letter to my chest, feeling something fierce and fragile crack open inside me, a grief I'd never been allowed to feel, and a certainty I had never known. I had not been abandoned. I had been protected, and someone my mother had trusted me to finish what she could not. When I finally lifted my head, my voice was steady. We open the testimony, I said. And then we bring down everything Gregory ever built. Harper nodded once. Jonas bowed his head like someone witnessing the return of something sacred. And somewhere outside the castle walls, as lightning split the sky, the drone continued circling, but now I knew it wasn't hunting me. It was running out of time. The letter from my mother stayed in my hands long after the others had drifted away to give me space. I stood in the center of her room, her real room frozen in time, while the storm pressed against the castle walls in restless, uneven waves. The lavender scent hung faintly in the air, subtle and aching like a memory trying to survive inside stone. I read her words again, tracing them with my thumb. You were never meant to live in your father's shadow. You were born from the fight against everything he built. Each line was a revelation. Each stroke of her pen felt like she had reached across the years just to reassure me. She had loved me. She had tried to protect me, and my father had taken her away because she knew something he couldn't allow to survive. Clara, Jonas said softly from the doorway, "There's more we need to uncover. Are you ready?" No, I wasn't. But ready had never mattered in the Hawthorne family. Only will. I folded the letter with care, as if it were a living thing, and slipped it inside my coat. Show me what comes next. We walked together through the quiet corridors until we reached the records hall. Harper was waiting there, standing over a stack of documents spread across the central table. The blue security lights overhead flickered as the wind swept hard against the windows. She didn't look up when we entered. Your mother was extraordinary, Clara. The words made my chest tighten. Tell me what you know. Harper exhaled slowly, bracing herself. Your mother was the first person brave enough to confront Gregory about the charity fraud. She discovered the missing funds, millions, and she traced them back to offshore accounts your father created. A shiver crawled through me. What did she do? She gathered evidence, Harper said. She prepared to testify, and she trusted the wrong people with the truth. Meaning him, I said. Yes, Harper murmured. Gregory found out, and everything changed. Jonas crossed his arms, jaw tight. William told me some of what happened, but never enough. He said Leora had to leave. That staying meant certain death. My throat closed painfully around the truth. He threatened her. He threatened both of you, Harper corrected gently. And he nearly succeeded. The room felt colder. I pressed my palm against the table, grounding myself. Harper, I said quietly, Why do you think William trusted me to finish this? I didn't know him. I didn't know any of this. She finally looked at me, really looked. Because William saw strength in you long before you knew it was there. And because your mother asked him to protect you if anything happened to her. The words hit harder than any storm outside. I turned away, trying to breathe through the burn in my eyes. The truth was unraveling faster now, threads snapping free from knots that had held them for decades. "Show me what William left," I whispered. Harper nodded and gestured toward a thick folder marked Q007. Jonas brought it forward and set it gently on the table. Inside were transcripts, surveillance logs, bank transfers, and handwritten notes. But one page stood out, a copy of an unsigned testimony labeled Second Witness Subject L.L. Leora. My mother. I ran my fingers across the page. "She gave this statement?" I asked. "No," Harper said. "She never got the chance." I swallowed. "Then how did William get it?" "He reconstructed it," Harper replied, "based on the records she left behind, her notes, her interviews with victims of the fraud. He tried to preserve her voice." A tremor rippled through me, part grief, part something far fiercer. "Why would he do all of this alone?" I asked. Jonas answered softly, "Because no one else could be trusted." The lights above flickered again. Harper frowned at the console. Drones still circling us, and louder now. Jonas tightened his jaw. Gregory's not going to wait much longer. I straightened, feeling the weight of my mother's words burning inside me. "Then we get ahead of him," I said. "What's our next step?" Harper exchanged a look with Jonas, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small data card. "This," she said, "is the missing piece of William's testimony." My heart raced. The encrypted file, yes. He split it into 2 halves. He gave me this one, and he left the other for you. Jonas went still. "That means once we merge them, we'll have the complete account. And once we open it," Harper added, "the truth will be undeniable." I stared at the small chip in her hand. "That truth," I whispered, "is what got him killed, isn't it?" Harper lowered her gaze. "Yes, and it's what nearly killed your mother." I felt anger flare, quiet, controlled, sharper than grief. "We're not letting him win again." Harper nodded. "Then you need to understand what the testimony contains. William recorded not only the fraud, but the attempted murders tied to it." I felt the ground tilt. "Attempted murders," multiple, Harper said. "Witnesses who disappeared, accountants who drowned in supposed boating accidents, a charity worker who fell from a balcony, all ruled accidents. But William investigated each one." My skin prickled with cold. "And he tied them all to Gregory," I said. Harper hesitated. "Not all, but enough to expose a pattern." I sank into a chair, absorbing the enormity of it. My father wasn't simply cruel or controlling. He was dangerous, a man who destroyed lives to protect his empire. And I, his daughter, was now the one William had trusted to bring the truth to light. "Clara," Jonas said gently, "you're shaking." I looked down. My hands trembled violently, though I hadn't noticed. "I'm fine," I whispered, even though fine was the last thing I was. Jonas pulled a blanket from the back of a nearby chair and draped it around my shoulders. The gesture cracked something inside me, something that had remained braced since childhood. "Thank you," I murmured. He offered a small nod. Harper cleared her throat. "There's something else we need to prepare for." I looked up. "Gregory won't let this go," she said. "Not now that we're getting close. He will escalate. He already has," Jonas added. "He sent men after me the last time I tried to contact William." A chill rippled through me. "What happened?" "They didn't find me," Jonas said simply. Harper folded her arms. "He will try harder with you." I forced myself to breathe. Then we moved faster. "What's our next step?" Harper pointed to the second wing. "You must access the remaining vaults." William left additional witness records, and they might contain the authentication key needed to open his testimony. Jonas nodded. "The vault labeled Wing C Room 19. We haven't opened it yet. I thought only William had access, I said. Not entirely, Jonas replied. He set it to unlock for his designated successor. Me, I said. Yes, he answered. But you may not like what's inside. I haven't liked anything I've learned so far, I said, standing again. But I still need the truth. Harper stepped closer, her eyes unwavering. Then prepare yourself, because the deeper we dig, the darker your father's secrets become. A distant siren suddenly chimed through the castle's speaker system. Jonas spun toward the panel on instinct. That's not weather, he said, voice tight. Someone's probing the outer security field. My pulse surged. Gregory, possibly Harper said, or someone working for him. I turned toward the hallway that led to Wing C, feeling an urgency burn through me that overpowered the fear. He can circle this island all he wants, I said, but he won't get here before I do. Jonas grabbed a lantern. Harper secured her files. The wind outside howled like the sea was raging against the cliffs, but the sound only steeled me further. We moved through the hallways quickly, the light ahead flickering in sharp, uneven bursts as the storm gained strength. When we reached the sealed door to Wing C, the biometric scanner glowed faintly. Jonas positioned himself at my side. Ready? I exhaled. Yes. I pressed my hand to the scanner. A soft beep. Then, access granted. Door unlocked. The door slid open, slow cold air rushing past us like the breath of something long buried. Inside the room was dim but intact. Shelves lined the walls, and a single table stood beneath a dusty skylight. At the center of the table lay a carved wooden box with a familiar symbol entwined on its lid, WL. My throat tightened. Harper whispered Clara, "This was your mother's." I walked toward it, each step steady despite the storm pounding in my chest. When I reached the table, I placed both hands on the lid. Jonas and Harper stood silently behind me. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the truth waited. I opened the box. The wooden box opened with a soft, reluctant sigh, as if it had been holding its breath for years. I lifted the lid slowly, half afraid something fragile inside might crumble at my touch. But the contents were perfectly preserved documents wrapped in protective sleeves, a silver key unlike the one William had given me, and a small leather-bound book embossed with 2 initials. LH, my mother's initials. A surge of emotion hit so suddenly my knees nearly buckled, but Harper steadied me with a gentle hand at my elbow. "You can look," she whispered. I sat at the table and opened the book. The first page held a date from over 2 decades ago, and a single sentence written in delicate slanted script. If something happens to me, the truth must live somewhere. My throat tightened as I flipped through entries, short, incomplete, hurried fragments of a woman trying to outrun a storm closing around her. Some spoke of numbers, mismatched accounts, men visiting Gregory late at night. Others spoke of fear, quiet, suffocating fear. But the final entry froze me entirely. He knows. He will come for me. William is trying to help, but I cannot stay. If Clara ever finds this, tell her I never stopped fighting. My vision blurred. Harper reached for the book, but I held it against my chest like a heartbeat I wasn't ready to release. A soft alert chimed through the vault, one I had not heard before. Jonas turned sharply. "That's from the outer perimeter." He rushed to the panel mounted near the vault door and scanned the monitors. His jaw tightened. "There's movement on the southern cliff," he said. "Someone landed." My pulse slammed into my ribs. "Gregory's men!" "It's likely," Jonas said grimly. "They're searching for an entry point." Harper straightened her eyes sharp. "We go upstairs, now." "That box," she pointed at my mother's letters, "is leverage, which means it's also a target." I closed the book and tucked it inside my coat, the leather pressing against my heart like a vow I hadn't yet spoken. We hurried out of the vault, the door sealing behind us with a metallic hiss. The hallways felt colder, the walls vibrating faintly with the distant rhythmic thud of helicopter rotors. As we reached the main corridor, the castle's central screen flickered to life on its own. Jonas frowned. That's not possible. The screen brightened, and my father's face appeared. Gregory Hawthorne was seated at his office desk, immaculate in a dark suit, the Hawthorne crest gleaming behind him. His expression was calm, polished, and poisonous. "My dear Clara," he began, his voice smooth, falsely affectionate. "I hear you've isolated yourself on a piece of property that doesn't belong to you." I stiffened instinctively. Harper muttered, "He's gone public." Gregory continued, "Your behavior has raised concerns among family friends and legal partners. We fear you've fallen under the influence of individuals who seek to exploit you. I urge you return home. Let us help you before things escalate further." He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. The transmission ended abruptly, and the castle lights flickered with the sudden silence. "He's setting the stage," Harper said softly. "Painting you unstable, alone, manipulated." My stomach twisted. "Preparing the public for something." "Yes," Harper said. "So when he moves against you, no one will question it." A low buzzing sound filled the air, different from the helicopter, different from any storm. Jonas spun around. "Drone," he said. "A big one. Close." We ran to the window overlooking the lower cliffs. A massive drone hovered just above the waves, its scanning lights sweeping the rock face like fingers searching for a pulse. Harper grabbed the binoculars. "This is reconnaissance. They're mapping the castle's foundation." For what I whispered. Jonas didn't answer at first. Then he turned slowly toward me, face pale. "Breaching." My breath faltered. "They're going to break in." "They'll try," Jonas said. "But not yet. They're waiting for your father's order." A sharp chime cut through the hall. Jonas checked the console. "We have a call coming in." "From who?" Harper asked. Jonas stared at the screen, and when he spoke, his voice held a tremor of disbelief. "Harper, it's your number." Harper froze. "No," she whispered. "I didn't call anyone." The line connected automatically. A young man's voice came through, shaking, breathless. "Mom," Harper inhaled sharply, color draining from her face. "Eli, Mom. They came to the house. I don't know who they are. The sound cut off, replaced by rustling, a muffled gasp. A struggle. Then a man's voice, cold, smooth, familiar. "Would you like to see him again?" Harper. Harper staggered backward, hand covering her mouth. "Gregory," she whispered. "It's Gregory." The man on the line continued calmly. "You've caused me a great deal of inconvenience. I think it's time you corrected that." Harper's hands shook uncontrollably. "What do you want?" "You know what I want," Gregory said. "William's files. The testimony. Bring it to the mainland by midnight. Alone." My blood turned to ice. "If you refuse," Gregory added, "your son will disappear like all the others who got too close." Harper choked on a sob. "Eli, please." The line went dead. The silence that followed felt suffocating. "No," Harper whispered. "No, not Eli, he doesn't deserve." I moved to her side, gripping her shoulders. "We'll get him back." Her eyes filled with tears. "Clara, you don't understand. Gregory doesn't negotiate. He destroys." Jonas looked grim, jaw tight. "He took Harper's son to force our hand. He won't stop," Harper whispered. "He'll go after everyone. You, Jonas, anyone near the truth." I felt something inside me shift, like a knot that had held me together for years, suddenly loosening. "No," I said quietly. "Not this time." Harper shook her head. "Clara, we can't fight him and save Eli. Not both." "Yes," I said. "We can." How she whispered. I reached into my coat and pulled out the small silver key from the box, its surface cool, etched with markings I didn't recognize. "This key," I said, "isn't for a room." Jonas's eyes widened. "The auxiliary vault." "What is that?" Harper asked, voice breaking. "A contingency William built," Jonas said. "A failsafe. If the main testimony was compromised, the auxiliary vault contains copies and something else. What something else? Harper demanded. Jonas looked at me as if waiting to see if I'd already guessed. I had. "Leverage," I whispered, "on Gregory." Harper stared. Enough to stop him. Enough, Jonas said, to break him. Wind hammered the windows. The drone buzzed closer, its light slicing through the storm. Everything inside the castle felt poised on the edge of collapse. Harper wiped her tears, straightened, and lifted her chin. Tell me what we do. I closed my mother's notebook, feeling her strength settle into my bones. Then I met their eyes. We go to the auxiliary vault, I said. We finish what William started. We open the truth that Gregory tried to bury. Another rumble of thunder shook the floor. Jonas nodded. Harper steadied her breath. And together we walked toward the hidden passageway, toward the place where William's final secret waited. Toward the moment Gregory Hawthorne had feared for 20 years. Gregory arrived without hesitation, as if the island had never been sealed off from him, as if he still believed the world bowed at the weight of his footsteps. Jonas and I watched from the upper balcony as the black helicopter sliced through the fading light wind, roaring across the courtyard in sharp, vicious bursts. It touched down like a threat, slow, deliberate, announcing itself with the certainty of a man who had never once been denied. I felt nothing at first. No fear, no grief, only a tight, simmering clarity building beneath my ribs. Jonas touched my elbow. Remember, he'll try to dictate the tone. Don't let him. I nodded, though my pulse hammered hard enough to bruise bone. The helicopter door opened. 2 armored men stepped out first, scanning the courtyard with practiced precision. Then Gregory appeared, tall, pristine, in a charcoal coat, hair perfectly combed, despite the wind, the Hawthorne emblem glinting like a blade on his lapel. He looked older than I remembered, but colder too. Sharper, a man carved from control. Clara, he called, upward voice smooth and strong enough to carry over the roar of the blades. Come greet your father. Father. The word no longer meant what he thought it did. I stepped out from the balcony's shadows and descended the stone steps into the courtyard. Jonas followed, but kept a respectful distance behind me. Gregory's eyes gleamed as he watched me approach. You've made quite the spectacle of yourself. You came uninvited, I said quietly. Seems like you're the one making a spectacle. A faint smile curved his mouth, patronizing, dismissive, dripping with the confidence of a man who believed he owned every room he walked into. Let's not pretend, he said. You're out of your depth. This island, this charade William crafted for you, it's a liability you don't understand. A gust of wind whipped across the courtyard, carrying the scent of sea spray. I held my ground. I understand more than you think I said. He tilted his head. Do you? Because from where I stand, it looks like you've been manipulated by 2 people who want to see this family burn. Harper is speaking the truth, I said. Harper Lane, he said with a scoff. A washed-up journalist, desperate for relevance. And Jonas, just a servant, William manipulated into believing myths. Jonas didn't flinch. You're deflecting, I said calmly. You didn't come here to insult them. You came here for the testimony. His smile vanished. Ah, there it was, the truth beneath the facade. You don't know what you're talking about, he said. Yes, I whispered. I do. He stepped closer, lowering his voice into something just above a growl. Then let me be perfectly clear. If you hand over the files, we can end this peacefully. No more scandals. No legal battles. You return home, and we restore the family together. I almost laughed. Restore what? The illusion. He didn't blink. You are my daughter, Clara. You're not my father, I said. You forfeited that the night you told me to get out, and long before that when you stole my mother from me. His jaw tensed, barely visible, but enough. You don't know a thing about her, he said. Leora was unstable, vulnerable. She imagined conspiracies. She lied. William believed her, I said. William was a fool. He died for what he knew. Gregory's eyes flashed with something unmistakable fear. It was brief, controlled, but real. You have no proof, he said. I stepped forward until only a few feet separated us. I have everything. William's notes, my mother's records, and his voice on testimony naming you." His breath stilled. The courtyard seemed to freeze with him. "You're bluffing," he said. "No," I whispered. "I'm finally telling the truth." He looked past me toward the helicopter, toward the castle, toward the wings where secrets he had buried were beginning to resurrect themselves. The confidence that had carried him onto the island began to fracture. He motioned sharply to his bodyguard, who stepped forward carrying a silver briefcase. "Open it," Gregory ordered. The guard set the case on a stone bench and unlatched it. Inside was a folder thicker than anything I had ever seen with my name typed across the top. I didn't move. Gregory tapped the folder. "Everything in here is ready to be filed. Bank transactions, stolen passwords, claims of psychological instability, statements from witnesses who describe you as volatile, paranoid, unwell." He said the last word gently as if comforting. It made my skin crawl. "You forged all of it," I whispered. "No," he said. "I curated it. For your sake." "My sake," I repeated. "Yes," Gregory said, stepping close enough that his breath touched my cheek. "Because if you continue down this path, if you embarrass us, if you challenge me, your life will end in a courtroom. Or worse." I stared at him, studying the man I once tried so hard to love. "You know what I realized?" I said softly. "It was never about protecting me, or the family, or the legacy." He tilted his head, waiting. "It was about control," I said. "Yours. Always yours." For the first time, he lost composure. "You child," he hissed. "You have no idea what I've done for you. Stolen my mother. Lied about her death. Lied about William. Lied about everything." He stepped back, face tight with fury, and motioned to his men. "We're done here. Seize the files, and bring her to the helicopter." Jonas moved instantly, stepping between us. "You will not touch her." Gregory's lip curled. "You forget your place, Hale." "No," Jonas said. "For the first time, I remember it." Gregory lunged, but I was faster. I reached into my coat and pulled out the small audio device Jonas had given me earlier. I pressed play. William's voice filled the courtyard, ghostly, steady, undeniable. "If you're hearing this, Clara, it means Gregory has acted on the threats he made. He stole from those who trusted him. He silenced those who tried to expose him. And if he harms you, let this record be the truth he cannot destroy." Gregory froze. The guards froze. Even the wind seemed to stop long enough to hear the dead speak. I met Gregory's eyes as William continued. "My brother cannot be trusted with power. He cannot be trusted with the Hawthorne name. And he cannot be trusted with my niece, who is stronger than he ever allowed himself to believe." Silence followed, heavy, damning, complete. Gregory's face cracked open with something twisted between rage and terror. You don't have the rest," he sputtered. "I don't need the rest," I said. "I only needed you to hear his voice." He stepped back as if struck. I lifted my chin. "Leave the island." He shook his head. "No, I won't." "Then watch carefully," I said, "because this time I'm the one giving orders." Jonas pressed a button on the control panel near the courtyard gate. The castle doors slammed shut. The external floodlights ignited in blinding white, and a siren wailed across the cliffs, signaling every defense system on the island. Gregory flinched, his confidence crumbling. I stepped toward him, calm at last. "You're afraid," I whispered. "Not of me, of the truth, of what William left, of what my mother knew." Gregory's voice cracked. "You think you've won?" "No," I said. "Winning comes later. This is only the beginning." He made one last desperate motion toward the briefcase, as if reclaiming it might salvage something. Jonas grabbed him by the arm, not violently, but with a certainty that stopped Gregory cold. "Your time is up," Jonas said. Gregory's gaze darted between us, calculating, unraveling, destroying itself in real time. Then he jerked his arm away and stalked toward the helicopter, signaling his guards to retreat. They followed him in tense silence, understanding the shift in power long before he would accept it himself. The helicopter lifted into the stormy sky, moments later swallowed by darkness and wind. Jonas closed the courtyard gate behind us. I didn't move. I stood there long after the last echo of the blades vanished, my mother's letter in my coat, William's voice on the wind, and the truth beating like a second heart in my chest. For the first time in my life, Gregory Hawthorne had looked at me and seen something he didn't understand. Strength. And for the first time I had looked at him and seen something I never expected. Fear. Not of what I had done, but of what I was about to do. Gregory's helicopter had barely vanished into the clouds when the castle's central console began vibrating with incoming alerts, dozens of them flashing red across the screen like a warning heartbeat. Jonas leaned in, scanning rapidly, his brows tightening. "He's already moving," he murmured. "This level of activity. He's not retreating, he's retaliating." I exhaled slowly. Of course he is. The courtyard still echoed faintly with the thrum of the helicopter blades, but the island itself felt unnervingly still, as if waiting for what came next. Harper hurried into the hall, her coat half-buttoned, her expression strained. "He's been arrested," she said. Both Jonas and I turned to her sharply. "Gregory?" I asked. "No," Harper said. "Not yet. But the federal agents are at his office. They're executing a warrant. This is it, Clara, the moment William spent decades preparing for." My pulse quickened. "What triggered it, you did?" Harper breathed. "The audio file you played, the partial testimony, went viral online. Some reporter must have overheard the broadcast from the island's frequencies. Federal investigators couldn't ignore it. A strange sensation washed through me, part disbelief, part relief, part terror." Jonas switched the console to the national news feed. There he was, Gregory Hawthorne. Standing in the marble lobby of Hawthorne Tower, surrounded by camera flashes, flanked by agents in dark jackets marked with 3 letters that cut through any pretense. He wasn't being dragged, but he wasn't walking freely either. His jaw clenched. His hands trembled just enough to betray everything his arrogance tried to conceal. "Gregory Hawthorne has been taken into federal custody," the reporter announced. "Charges include embezzlement, fraud, collusion, and obstruction of justice. More charges may follow." Harper whispered, "It's starting." I didn't speak. I watched. I watched the man who had shaped my childhood with fear and manipulation try to shield his face from the cameras. I watched him stumble as an agent guided him toward the waiting vehicle. I watched the illusion of invincibility slip from his shoulders like a dying ember. And for the first time I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not vengeance, but release. Harper placed a hand on my back. "Clara, he can't hurt you anymore." But part of me didn't believe that, not fully. Not yet. Gregory's power had never lived only in money or influence. It lived in the people he controlled, the lies he crafted, the shadows he cast. "Let's finish it," I whispered. Jonas nodded already, switching to the encrypted upload terminal William had installed decades earlier. "The evidence is ready," he said. "But once we send it, there's no going back. It will all become public record." "That's the point," I said. We gathered everything William had left: documents, recordings, contracts, transcripts. My mother's notes, her testimony draft, William's final video message, even the files from the auxiliary vault Harper and I had opened the night before. It was enough to dismantle Hawthorne dominance from the inside out, enough to end the lies, enough to end him. Jonas began uploading. 1 file, 10 files, 50 files, hundreds. Each one transferred to the federal repository with a soft chime that echoed through the hall. Harper watched the screen, her breath shallow. "This will expose every shell company, every bribe, every offshore fund. He can't deny any of it, not with his own signatures on half the documents." My chest tightened, remembering the years I'd begged Gregory for the truth about my mother. The way he'd stared at me with cold disappointment whenever I dared to question his narrative. He had stolen my mother. He had tried to steal me. And William, who had never owed me anything, had risked his life to stop him. A final file appeared on the transfer queue. William Hawthorne. Last testimony. Complete. My breath hitched. Press it, Harper whispered. I placed my hand over the console and sent the last file. The upload confirmed with a steady blue glow. Jonas exhaled deeply. It's done. The truth is in the hands of the law now. A quiet settled over the room, not peaceful but resolved. The storm outside calmed as though the sea itself had been holding its breath. Then Harper's phone chimed sharply. She glanced at the screen and went pale. Clara. You need to see this. She turned the phone toward me. A live stream. News anchors speaking urgently. Then footage. Gregory, handcuffed, escorted to a car. Suddenly he turned, camera lights flashing across his face, and he spoke directly into the nearest microphone. My daughter did this. My breath stopped. She has been manipulated by criminals, he said. She is unstable. She is dangerous. She requires psychiatric intervention for her own safety. My whole body froze. Jonas cursed under his breath. He's trying to undermine your credibility before the evidence hits, Harper said. He wants people to believe you're unwell. I swallowed hard. It doesn't matter. The truth is out. Harper shook her head slowly. Clara. He's not speaking to the courts. He's speaking to the public. The people who will shape the narrative. The people who don't read legal documents, they read headlines. I stared at the screen at the man who had raised me, who had convinced the world he was a model citizen, who had convinced me for years that I was the weak one. He's still trying to control me, I whispered. Not anymore, Jonas said. Look. He pulled up the main newsfeed again. This time the reporters weren't repeating Gregory's claims. They were questioning them. They were questioning him. Sources confirm that Mr. Hawthorne has filed false statements in the past. Investigators are now probing claims that witnesses connected to the family disappeared. Former employees describe Gregory Hawthorne as controlling and volatile. And then legal expert Evelyn Price states that Clara Hawthorne is cooperating with federal law enforcement and has been instrumental in providing key evidence. My breath wavered as Evelyn appeared on screen, composed, confident. Clara Hawthorne is not unstable, she said firmly. She is brave, and she is telling the truth. My vision blurred for a moment. Evelyn had stood up for me loudly, publicly, fiercely. Something inside me unclenched. Harper touched my arm gently. You're not fighting alone anymore. A soft ding sounded from the console. More responses, Jonas said. From people you helped without knowing. People William helped. Messages scrolled across the screen. You're doing the right thing. He hurt us too. Thank you for exposing him. William saved my family. Thank you for finishing what he started. You're not alone, Clara. Tears burned behind my eyes, not from sadness. From something I hadn't felt since childhood. Belonging. Jonas approached me with something in his hand, a small wooden box I recognized instantly. Williams. I didn't show you this earlier, he said. I wanted to wait. He opened it. Inside was a flash drive sealed with wax. I frowned. We already uploaded everything. This one isn't evidence, Jonas said. It's a message. He handed it to me gently. For you. My chest tightened. I inserted the drive into the console. A single audio file appeared. I clicked it. William's voice filled the room, gentler this time, warmer, like a man speaking not from fear or urgency, but from hope. Clara, he said, if you've reached this point, then you have done what neither Leora nor I could do. You survived him, and you exposed him. You have broken a cycle that began long before you were born. A tear slid down my cheek. William continued, The Hawthorne legacy is yours now, not the one Gregory twisted, but the one your mother believed in. A legacy of protection, of truth, of rebuilding what power destroyed. Something in me cracked open softly like a door finally giving way to sunlight. William ended with a whisper. I was proud of you long before you knew my name. The audio faded into silence. Jonas stepped forward, placing a steady hand on my shoulder. Harper wiped her eyes discreetly. I stood there breathing in the quiet that followed, letting the truth settle into me not as a burden, but as a beginning. My father's empire was collapsing, my mother's voice had returned. William's final wish had been carried out, and for the first time in my life I was standing on solid ground, not a shadow, not a pawn, not a victim. A hawthorn. But on my terms. And this time, nothing and no one would take that away. The castle felt different the morning after Gregory's arrest, as if the walls themselves had taken a long breath after years of bracing for impact. Sunlight spilled across the stone floors in soft golden strokes, warming rooms that had known only cold vigilance for far too long. For the first time since stepping onto the island, I didn't feel watched. I didn't feel hunted. I didn't feel like prey moving between shadows. I felt present, alive, mine. I walked the length of the corridor slowly, my fingers brushing the carved rail of the upper balcony, and listened to the quiet hum of the sea. Jonas waited for me at the end of the hall, his posture relaxed for once. "Morning, Miss Hawthorne," he said gently. "You slept. I hadn't even realized it. For the first time in days." He nodded. "You'll need your strength. Today is meaningful." Meaningful, the word carried its own weight. Because of William's final message, because of everything Jonas replied. His message, your mother's truth, Gregory's arrest, and your future, my future. A concept that had always felt abstract, something belonging to other people, other families, other lives. Now it was here waiting behind every door of this island. "What did you find?" I asked softly. Jonas motioned toward William's study. "There's one more file. It was hidden in the system under a secondary encryption key. It only triggered after your testimony upload last night." I followed him inside. William's study looked smaller today, as though time itself had softened its edges, now that the secrets it guarded were no longer shackled. Jonas opened a drawer beneath the desk and lifted out a sealed envelope. To Clara, the front read in William's unmistakable hand. My voice almost broke. He wrote another. Jonas placed it into my hands. "It was meant to reach you only after Gregory fell." My pulse stuttered. I broke the seal and unfolded the letter. "Clara, if you are reading this, then the truth has carried you farther than fear ever could. You have done what I could not, what your mother attempted and what your father tried to bury. You have reclaimed your name. Now you must decide what it will stand for." I sank into his chair, the weight of his words settling over me in warm, steady waves. This island was not built to hide from your father. It was built so that someone like you, someone unbound by his corruption, could rebuild what he destroyed. Let Bastion belong to the people who need it. Let it become a refuge, not a throne. And when you feel lost, remember you were never alone. W.H. A quiet knowledge filled me, rising like dawn. I hadn't just inherited a castle, I had inherited purpose. Harper entered the room softly, holding a cup of tea that she set beside me. She looked tired but determined, a woman weathered by survival but not defined by it. "I heard the alert this morning," she said. "They're already confirming more charges against Gregory. RICO tax evasion conspiracy. It's all unraveling." I nodded. It won't bring back what he stole, but it stops him from taking anything else. Harper placed a hand over mine. "Clara, yesterday you saved far more people than you realize. There were families ruined by the charity fraud. Former employees silenced. Victims who thought no one would ever listen. You exposed the truth for all of them." Emotion struck deep in my chest. I did it for my mother, for William, for the version of myself he tried to erase. And now Harper said gently, "Do something for you." I looked up. "For me, yes." She smiled faintly. "Begin again." Those two words lingered long after she left the room. Begin again. I walked through the castle, the quiet vault, the records hall, the upper terraces, seeing everything not as relics of the past, but as foundations for something new, something I could build, not just inherit. When I reached the northern balcony, I found Jonas adjusting the solar arrays that powered the island during storms. "Jonas," I said softly, "will you stay as caretaker, advisor, partner in rebuilding this place?" He straightened slowly, surprise flickering across his features. "Stay, Miss Hawthorne." This was William's dream. I would have followed him anywhere. His expression softened. "And now it's yours. Of course I'll stay." The wind lifted off the sea, carrying warmth instead of threat. I looked toward the horizon, letting its brightness settle into my bones. "I want to use the island the way William intended," I said. "A sanctuary for people running from the kind of power my father abused. A place where no one is silenced, where truth is protected, not hidden." Jonas nodded once. "A new dynasty." "Yes," I whispered. "But not the Hawthorne dynasty my father tried to force on the world. Something better." I felt my chest loosen slowly, gently, as if the island itself had been holding a breath until I spoke those words. Hours later, Evelyn called. Her face appeared on the screen, wind-blown from reporters crowding outside the courthouse. "Clara," she said, breathless, "you did it. The prosecutors said your testimony files were the final push. Gregory will be held without bail." I closed my eyes. It was over. Not the grief, not the rebuilding, but the fear. "How are you feeling?" Evelyn asked softly. For a long moment I didn't answer. "Then I feel like the truth finally belongs to me." Evelyn smiled, proud and relieved. "And now you get to decide what comes next." After the call ended, I returned to my mother's room. The lavender had faded over the years, but the warmth lingered somehow, still alive in the fibers of the shawl left on the chair, the slight imprint on the pillow, the letters she folded with her own hands. I placed her letter back inside the carved box and whispered, "I'll make you proud." Wind rustled against the skylight like an answer. By the time the sun set, the castle no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a beginning. I opened the main balcony doors and stepped out into the night air. Waves crashed far below, washing the cliffs clean. Stars glimmered above the black water, scattered like new possibilities across an entirely different sky than the one I grew up under. "I'm ready," I whispered into the wind, "for whatever comes next." And I meant it. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't running from a Hawthorne legacy. I was becoming the one who rewrote it. Thank you so much for staying with me through this journey. If Clara's story moved you, if her strength or her search for truth resonated in any way, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment, share what part touched you most, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story we explore together. Your presence here truly means the world.